Hello to everyone who's joined this webinar. Welcome, whether it's the morning, afternoon or evening for you, a very warm welcome. This is the second in a series of Article 6 focused webinars that Gold Standard is running over the course of this year with support from the government of Germany. Just to give some context at the start, 5 months have now passed since the close of COP26 in November of last year and the adoption there of Article 6 guidance. In our last webinar, which some of you may have joined, we looked at the process of a government authorising mitigation outcomes under Article 6 and applying a corresponding adjustment, and some of the things that are now known after we have the adoption of Article 6 guidance and some of the things which are still not known yet. The question that we're focused on in today's webinar is what has happened since COP26 to start to put Article 6 into practice? And what's going on now to take Article 6 from the text agreed by negotiators last November to actual transfers of mitigation outcomes across borders. And a lot of work is happening across the world right now to build readiness and to implement Article 6 within governments, within the private sector, and within standards like ours. But this isn't always very visible. And this is the purpose of today's event, to shine a spotlight on some of the encouraging and ambitious work that is going on across the world to implement Article 6 and to understand some of the main takeaways and the lessons from this work so far. We're very fortunate to have with us today 4 distinguished panelists who are all working on Article 6 implementation from various different angles and are all really well placed to give an introduction to some of the work which is happening so far and then to take some of your questions nearer the end of the webinar. So I'll start by just giving a brief introduction of each panelist, and then I'm going to hand over to them to say a little bit more about themselves and the work which they are doing. So first we have Aglaja Espelage, who is a researcher at Perspectives Climate Group. We have Alexandra Soezer, Global Carbon Technical Advisor in the Nature, Climate and Energy team at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. We have Emma Åberg, Programme Manager for International Climate Cooperation at the Swedish Energy Agency. And we have Frédéric Gagnon-Lebrun, Business Director for Climate Policy and Carbon Pricing at South Pole. So I'm going to hand over now to each of our panelists in turn, just to give a few minutes of introduction to the work which they and their organisation are doing. Then we're going to have a round of questions to each of our panelists. And as we go through today's webinar, please feel free to write questions into the chat box as we go, and we will take up as many of those questions as we can nearer the end of the webinar. So that is the route in this webinar, to ask your questions, to get clarification, ask the thing which has been burning for a while. Please write them in the chat as we go. So Aglaja, turning to you first, it'd be great if you could give a bit of an introduction to the work which you and Perspectives are doing.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And yes, may I quickly introduce Perspectives. So we are a consultancy and research group focusing on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and with a strong focus as well on mitigation instruments, policy instruments, and also carbon markets. And in the context of Article 6, I would say that in the past few years, we have been on the one hand supporting the rulemaking process through supporting negotiators and doing conceptual work on lessons learned in carbon markets so far and doing concrete proposals. But we have also been supporting governments and public institutions in preparing for Article 6 collaboration. For instance, how to set eligibility criteria for activities, how to think about activities in the context of their NDCs, how to set up the national institutions. For instance, we're supporting both the West and Eastern African Alliance on carbon markets and climate finance, just to give one example. But we have also been setting up a dialogue process with the Carbon Market Mechanisms Working Group to learn from each other and discuss both rulemaking processes and lessons from piloting. But we're also supporting program developers engaged in Article 6 activities, as well as heavily engaged ourselves in some pilots. And we're also focusing on the development of the methodological framework for these activities and how these methodological frameworks will have to be adapted now for Article 6. And I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Aglaja. Alexandra, over to you.
Yeah, Hugh, thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to share what UNDP is doing on carbon markets and Article 6. So in general, UNDP is really well positioned with its network of country offices to enhance countries' capacities and provide technical advice so that countries can strategically engage in carbon markets. On the one hand, UNDP aims to provide high-level strategic information and guidance to host governments, but also concrete technical assistance to countries so that they can define their engagement in carbon markets. And this includes engagement in international carbon market mechanisms under the UNFCCC. And here we support capacity building to governments on institutional and technical readiness for ITMO transfers, development of digital solutions to promote 6.2 cooperation, engagement with government and non-governmental buyers to support direct implementation of projects under Article 6.2, and general capacity building for private sectors through webinars, workshops, and trainings. And then we support the engagement in international voluntary carbon markets by private standards. This includes technical support to governments for the generation of high integrity voluntary carbon credits. We are also participating in the voluntary carbon market initiative to enhance the transparency of voluntary carbon markets. And then we support countries to develop domestic carbon markets and carbon neutrality programs, such as the Programa UELAC Chile with the Ministry of Environment of Chile. And over the past few years, UNDP has supported Ghana and Vanuatu specifically on their Article 6.2 readiness efforts. This support led to the signature of bilateral ITMO transfer agreements between Ghana and Vanuatu as host countries and Switzerland as a buyer country. And we are currently supporting the development of the first ITMO projects, which will directly help operationalize cooperation under Article 6.2. But maybe I stop here for now, and back to you, Hugh.
Great, thank you very much, Alexandra. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and thanks for the invitation to share our experiences here. So I work with the Swedish Energy Agency, which is mandated by the Swedish government to lead Sweden's engagement in Article 6, both in the climate negotiations, but now also as a buyer of ITMOs, International Transport Mitigation Outcomes. Sweden has been engaged in carbon markets for a long time, for 20 years now, and we are in the early process now then to implement Article 6. We are currently signing MOUs and started negotiating bilateral framework agreements with a number of host countries. And in parallel, we're working with developing a project portfolio of projects or mitigation activities. We're also engaging, of course, in the methodological discussions and development that is ongoing. So I look forward to this discussion with all of you.
Thanks so much, Emma. And finally, over to you, Frédéric.
Great, thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you for the invitation. This is looking forward to the discussion, much needed, and hopefully will help everyone advance their thinking. I'm with South Pole. South Pole was started as a carbon project developer back in 2006 and has since developed over 700 projects in about 40 countries, and this remains a core activity within South Pole. South Pole has grown as well in developing its advisory services for corporates, supporting them in what we call their climate journey, setting targets, decarbonization strategies, as well as offsetting strategies and providing offsets to these corporates. Where I sit within South Pole is in a team focusing on climate policy and carbon pricing that has a dual role. One of them is to do consulting work, supporting, for instance, governments in developing Article 6 governance frameworks, strategies around using Article 6, as well as strategies on NDCs, helping countries cost the NDC implementation, for example. And we also develop a number of activities, mitigation activities under Article 6, notably for the CLIC Foundation. For example, the SHIFT program in Thailand on e-mobility, and the establishment of an energy efficiency investment fund in Morocco. So both of which are with the CLIC Foundation. And that experience, concrete experience in developing mitigation activities, help us spread the expertise and the experience on thinking through project development from an Article 6 perspective throughout South Pole, and the team specifically that works on sourcing and project development on the voluntary market today. So that brings me to our second role, internal role, is essentially training and working very closely with that team that sources projects to start identifying projects that would comply with the Article 6 rules and be able to secure letters of authorization and corresponding adjustments from governments.
Great. Thank you very much, Frédéric, and thanks everyone. And your final point there is a good segue into the first question, which I wanted to ask to Aglaja, which is about how Article 6 will mark a shift from the types of activities which have operated in the past under the carbon market. So you mentioned that the Perspectives is leading an initiative to develop tools and approaches to underpin Article 6 activities. And it would be good to hear a bit more from that work so far and from your work more generally about what looks the same and what looks different really when we come to Article 6.
Yes, I would say, well, first of all, I think that the type of activities will change that we will see under Article 6 and what we have seen in a large part of the carbon market in the past, just because I'd say governments will have to capture more of the, let's say, cost-effective measures for their own NDC implementation and let's say, hopefully the offsetting carbon market segment, let's call it like that, will shift more towards higher cost mitigation activities. That will change the carbon market. It hopefully will also change in the type of scale of activities that is being supported through carbon markets. But then also, and what I would like to focus on is that the methodological requirements for activities will change, and that will, of course, directly also change what kind of activities will be eligible in carbon markets. So we have been working conceptually on rules for Article 6 activities. And then we had been looking through that lens of understanding, we have new principles, we have the NDCs of the host country, we have the understanding of an increased ambition over time, we have the lessons learned and the from the CDM, from joint implementation about loopholes, or let's say approaches that didn't work well, or approaches that weren't revised enough. So we had all that, and we looked at, let's say, Article 6 pilot activities underway, and we felt there's some missing guidance there for program developers to actually take those principles and make them work in a methodological framework in a very straightforward view. We need more tools of how to do that and more guidance. So we have developed over the past year the International Initiative for Article 6 methodology tools. And this initiative right now focuses on finding new approaches to determine whether an activity can be deemed additional, how to set the baseline, how to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification, and how to robustly explain and justify the links to the NDC, that it avoids overselling, and how it's aligned with a long-term strategy. So those are the goals for the tools. But now what is very important is, for now, these tools will be for project and program level activities. We see a lot of pilots still focusing on projects and programs, so we see a lot of relevance there. Not to say that we won't hopefully see also more upscaled approaches to crediting under Article 6, but we felt it was important to fix or let's say propose new tools to meet Article 6 criteria already now. So what I can see now, speaking for how projects and programs will change, and what we can see when we put together a group of experts from around the world, so we see ourselves being like a moderator of a closely knit expert discussion on these new methodologies, we saw a few things that will have to change. For instance, let's speak about additionality. When you take the, let's say, additionality tool from the CDM, we had been discussing how to check whether the activity has overselling risks for the host country. How help the program developer justify those links. That will require not only a regulatory surplus check that is already applied by some carbon market standards, but it will also apply a check against what is in the host country's NDC and what can be reasonably expected to be done by the host country and under its unconditional NDC. The interesting part here is that in our view, That will still require engagement with the host country because they will have the final say on this. But we do want to be able to give a methodological approach to define that link to help both the host country and the program developer. So that will already really shift the type of assessment that is necessary. Then we still will require an assessment for also financial additionality, where I think some lessons can be learned from how these tests were done in the past, and the stringency can be improved. And we will also include some further guidance on how positive lists are developed, because we felt that in the past, often positive lists were not developed with the necessary expert input. They were not revised often enough. So we want to include some further methodological guidance on this. Last but not least, additionality, but also baselines will have to be reassessed now when crediting periods are renewed, because we have the principles of increasing ambition over time. But we will also have the host country prerogative to increase the ambition in their NDC, which changes fundamentally every 5 years how an activity relates to the NDC. So that is a big change of context for many carbon market activities around the world. Speaking about baselines, I would say a big change that we see from the discussion is that baselines will have a more long-term perspective where we'll look at the activity in the long-term view of a long-term strategy. It doesn't mean that the baseline is a long-term strategy baseline, but you will have to align the reference scenarios of the NDC, the long-term development pathways of a country, and then make a robust justification of how your activity fits in there to actually ensure that you're not leading to carbon lock-in. So this is a big part of what we're trying to do, finding good approaches to justify your activity that does not lead to carbon lock-in. So those are a few things that we've been thinking about that will fundamentally change, I think, already the type of activities that in the end, using those tools, will be able to generate credits as per these tools, and the amount of credits that they can generate, and how they can communicate to the host country how this links to their NDC. Well, to give a bit of an update where we are with this initiative, so we have now concluded the concept phase, and we will upload concept notes on these, what we think could be future tools for Article 6 in the coming weeks on our website. And then the idea is to develop those tools over the coming months. And we do hope they can be applied so we actually see a shift in the type of activities that get funded through carbon markets on the ground, and the way they're justified to be eligible as offsets, and the amount of credits that they can generate and for which amount of time.
Great.
I'll stop here. And thank you.
No, thanks so much for that, Aglaja. And I mean, the market as a whole needs to think about Paris alignment and what this means in practice, and it's something that we're thinking about in Gold Standard. So the types of tools which are being developed through the work you're moderating is really important for us, and I think for the market as a whole. Alexandra, coming to you now. So as part of kind of the wide range of work that UNDP is doing, you mentioned the support which you have provided and continue to provide to a number of national governments. And it'd be great if you could give us a bit more of an insight into the types of support that you're providing and what the priorities are in this first year after the adoption of Article 6. So how do you start to build the capacity to implement what needs to happen over the next decade and beyond?
Yeah. Okay, so over the last year or 2 years, we have supported Vanuatu and Ghana to develop Article 6 regulatory frameworks, which define the rules and procedures for the implementation of ITMO projects, including governance structures and ITMO process flows. We also developed a global digital Article 6.2 mechanism platform to facilitate the implementation of ITMO projects. And this mechanism platform was co-developed with the Swiss Federal Office of the Environment and was set up for Vanuatu as first country, which will benefit directly from this platform. For Vanuatu, we also developed a national registry for ITMO issuances and transfers. And under the new Article 6 Transfer Readiness Assistance Project funded by Switzerland, which was launched in January 2022, we have started to engage with eligible countries. We signed bilateral agreements with Switzerland. And the first activity in the participating countries was a capacity gaps assessment. For this capacity gaps assessment, we used a tool which was developed by the World Bank and tested by UNDP. It's, among others, a mitigation action assessment protocol for international transfer readiness. And this tool identifies the readiness and regulatory gaps in these countries. As a result of this assessment, we identified with the countries the key capacity building activities, which will be implemented between now and 2024. The activities will include general capacity building for Article 6.2 implementation. This includes webinars and trainings and guidance also for line ministries. All countries will also receive ad hoc project implementation support for the key institutions that are leading ITMO project implementation, at least for the next 12 months. And the goal is to increase the efficiency of the ITMO implementation processes. Some countries, such as Georgia, will receive support to develop a policy framework, which will define a positive list of mitigation activities and the full ITMO project cycle. In Peru, specifically, we will support the operationalization of RENAMI, Peru's national registry, and test it on 1 to 2 pilot projects. And as already briefly mentioned, last year, we developed this global digital Article 6.2 mechanism platform, which will make it easier for countries to manage the ITMO process flows. The key feature of this platform is that it is modular and therefore easily amendable and scalable. New countries can be easily added and at low cost. And with the customization option, we will be able to offer this digital platform to all participating countries that currently don't have any digital system in place. And this year, our priority will be to add new features to this platform. This will include a web app for monitoring. The web app will be linked to a new module in the platform to allow project proponents to upload monitoring information directly. And we will test this web app on a rice project in Ghana, where the participating farmers can use the web app to monitor the water levels on the fields and report this directly to the platform, where the information can be accessed by project proponents, the focal point in the government, and verifiers. We will also add a webbooks feature to give other platforms and also national registries access to data stored in the country settings of the platform. And this includes, of course, also security layers for authentications and authorizations. And last but not least, we will add a blockchain for secure fee payments. A project proponent or a validator on behalf of a project proponent will then be able to make payments with blockchain. Another priority will be the development of national registries as a digital public good. We see here an exciting opportunity to develop national registries as a global digital public good, which can be reused by all countries that want to participate in ITMO transfers. The benefit of such a global digital public good for national registries is that it helps to avoid duplication of structures and costs. It eases information exchange, and it lowers IT implementation and lifetime costs and vendor logins. And last but not least, we will be able to make performance-based payments for 2.2 million ITMOs generated between 2023 and 2030 in target countries and from eligible project types. And through international tenders, we will engage project developers who have the capacity to upfront invest in projects, and exposed carbon payments will provide then an additional financial incentive for these project developers. The first tender will be launched in early May and will target Peru, and the second tender will be launched shortly after and will target Vanuatu. With this comprehensive support package, which includes targeted capacity building to governments on the one hand and direct financial incentives to project developers, we believe that we can really create the momentum here that is needed to operationalize Article 6.2. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. Thanks for that. And it's really impressive the amount of work which is going on there at UNDP. Emma, over to you now. So you mentioned in your introduction that the Swedish Energy Agency is starting to identify activities, and Aglaja talked earlier about some of the ways in which activities under Article 6 will maybe look different from some of those in the past. And I know that the Swedish Energy Agency is kind of focused on identifying activities which meet a certain set of criteria. So it'd be great if you could share a little bit more about the approach that you're taking to actually select activities which you may procure IMROs from in the future.
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying that this continues to be work in progress on our side. Definitely, we are, as I said, working now to establish an Article 6 framework, our own framework, and a strategy for selecting collaboration, both host countries and mitigation activities. So still work in progress, but when it comes to selecting mitigation activities, which you're asking about, we have established a set of selection criteria that remains to be developed further, but building basically on environmental integrity, sustainable development, transformational impact, and a few other criteria such as feasibility and price. But coming back also to what Aglaja said, environmental integrity is naturally of highest concern for us when selecting activities and projects. We will only be looking for activities that are truly additional. And in that regard, we are very much welcoming the tools that are being developed at the moment that Aglaja Perspectives are working on. We're looking to take an approach definitely where we will be looking beyond NDC compliance of our activities, which is still sometimes referred to as sufficient for determining additionality, but we will also be doing more specific additionality testing for sure to assess regulatory and financial additionality of the projects. A very important aspect, of course, of this work is to make sure that any Article 6 activity that we pursue would not compromise the host country's ability to reach their NDC. And we're looking at making this part of the approval and authorization process that the host country at some point can assure us or make some sort of evaluation of the specific project that we are interested in, guaranteeing to the extent that is possible that it will not jeopardize their NDC, because this is very important for us. Sustainable development contribution is another very important criteria where we would like to see that socioeconomic and environmental considerations are being well integrated into the activities and maximized if possible. In particular, gender consideration is an important topic for Sweden, making sure that women are given good opportunities to benefit from the activities in terms of employment, in terms of ownership, and so on. And we will be measuring and following up on these benefits we're looking to use the SDG impact tool that Åberg is developing at the moment. On the topic of sustainability, I think it's also important to mention, because this is something that could perhaps have been strengthened in Article 6 in the negotiation, is the question of safeguards. We would like to see strong environmental and social safeguards in any project that we engage in, and we're currently developing our own guidelines for that. All activities will undergo strict due diligence assessments and be managed in accordance with their kind of risk level or the categorization that we will determine that they have. When it comes to type of technologies and sectors that will be considered, we're trying to have an open approach at this point. We're considering a variety of sectors and technology depending on the needs of the host country very much. We're trying to have a very close dialogue to see basically what are the needs of the host country. But with that said, Sweden's Article 6 office is hosted by the Swedish Energy Agency, and energy-related projects will then naturally, of course, be an important share of our future project portfolio. Our mandate is to cooperate with low and middle-income countries, and many of which are still struggling to mobilize financing for energy efficiency and energy-related projects. So, yeah, but coming back again to what was said before, we do recognize that I mean, this will not be low-hanging projects in any sense. At the beginning, in this initial phase, we might not be targeting the most complex projects because we're still trying out the tools and methods. But eventually, we will be looking more towards hard-to-abate sectors, etc. And we will be doing that in collaboration with many other actors. We recognize that this is nothing that we can do alone, so to say, but we're doing it jointly with other actors in Sweden and other actors, multilateral actors, for example. Yeah, so I'll stop there for now and look forward to any questions you have.
Sorry, thank you very much, Emma. And just on what you were saying there, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and we will have time to get to them. So we welcome any questions that you have based on anything you've heard so far or anything else that's on your mind related to the subject. Frédéric, over to you now. I mean, so it's really good, I think, to have the perspective of an organisation which is developing projects here. So we kind of heard from Emma there about some of the things which a buying government is looking for in the activities which they want to procure it most from. But for a developer as well, it's very important. There's particular things that you're looking for in a country where you're going to operate, because there are particular things which provide a kind of better enabling environment for running activities under Article 6. And it'd be great if you could say a little bit more from your perspective about some of the things that you're looking for in a country to make it an attractive place to develop an Article 6 activity.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. And it is somewhat of a challenging question because it's very, very early days in terms of identifying and sourcing Article 6 projects. And there are various organizations, governments notably, and carbon project developers, going at it. And I feel like, one way to answer your question is to sort of flip it around and look at, what would be an ideal situation for a country. And then I can highlight some of the challenges that we're encountering as we are discussing with governments. And in fact, a country that would be attractive, would really have a very clear Article 6 policy, perhaps a positive list, as has been mentioned a number of times, that would provide a clear signal as to where we as a carbon project developer could dedicate our efforts and invest and guide project owners as well towards investments that would bear fruit effectively. And also a very clear process and transparent process to submit a request for a letter of authorization. And what we would expect as well is for the country to have the capacity to quickly assess programs and projects that would be put forward seeking the authorization in light of their NDC and in light of their strategy for best using Article 6 revenues towards greater climate action effectively. So that's, in a way, it's a lot to ask, and there's a lot of work going on, and it is absolutely needed along the lines of what Alexandra, Emma, and Aglaja have described, and I think it's very, very needed. A few things that I'd like to highlight around the process that carbon project owners and carbon developers would like to see. First of all, it would be really helpful for governments to be able to provide early assurances of the chances that a letter of authorization could be issued and that the project itself could generate ITMOs. And also we see that process not as a one-way process where you submit a request and you get a yes or no, but a process in which there will be built-in opportunities to exchange with governments, to provide clarifications, to make adjustments, modifications to baselines, to the scope of projects, etc., so that they better take into account the links with the NDCs, which are often not obvious from the perspective of the carbon developers, right? So this conversation really needs to happen so that an agreement can come to to bear. And lastly, that could also provide a space for negotiating the shares of emission reductions that could be accounted towards a country's NDC, and the rest of the emission reductions be generated as it moves and come with a corresponding adjustment. So creating these spaces for these dialogues in a very structured manner and with government officials is actually something that we would really welcome. So what we're doing today, and what makes countries attractive to start scoping out what could be done on Article 6, I guess our very first criteria is having a knowledgeable counterpart in government. And that means essentially focusing on countries that have already engaged on Article 6, that have benefited from a lot of Article 6 readiness initiatives that are out there, that have been on panels working on the new tools, for example, that Aglaja is mentioning, so that we can actually have constructive conversations with these governments about especially the links with their NDC. I think this is a really key aspect for us. But having that counterpart and even an institutional arrangement within the government, for example, an interministerial forum that was used to formulate the NDC and that could now be used to understand the links with the NDC, is a very good starting point. But in many ways, it's not enough. What is really needed from our perspective, especially as we start engaging with governments, is the focus on the NDC itself and the understanding of the country's NDC. So it's really challenging for many governments to understand the implications of offering and conducting a corresponding adjustment on their NDC implementation. So the risks of overselling, the risks of compromising the NDC implementation that Emma was referring to is really key and not necessarily well understood. So when you start scratching and asking questions about the scope of the NDC, for example, that raises questions about how the NDC itself, how the corresponding adjustment may or may not impact. So maybe I can run down three key points there. So governments with a very detailed NDC implementation plan is extremely helpful, because that then provides the lay of the land of what is beyond what the NDC is intended to do. So as a project developer, we would be looking for projects and presenting to the government projects that we suspect may not be triggered or incentivized by the policies and measures that a country wants to implement to implement its NDC and meet its target by 2030. So that's work that we're doing now with our sourcing team, effectively, to try to identify these things, to start conversations with governments around projects that we think have a chance of securing a letter of authorization because of this understood link with the NDC. The other one is the scope of the NDC. Very often the scope is quite unclear, and we find that if projects are outside the scope of the NDC, considering the fact that the Glasgow rules mean that the corresponding adjustment needs to be applied anyway, it essentially means that the emission reductions occur outside what the country would account for, so outside the greenhouse gas inventory for the scope of its NDC. But the country would actually have to increase its inventory to take into account that emission reduction that due to the corresponding adjustment. So that is, in effect, the government shooting itself in the foot. So understanding and unpacking the accounting rules and the impact on the NDC is really, really key. And so when starting to look into that, it makes it quite challenging for governments to understand all of this. And I very much look forward to many of the methodological tools that Aglaja mentioned to help governments work through that. And I would just close by saying that I think there's a lot of value that carbon project developers can add in starting to engage early with governments. I feel like we can't wait for governments to come out with very clear view on Article 6. I think this process of engaging with policymakers and asking questions about the intentions for of policies and measures to implement the NDC, what that might mean for certain types of projects, really can help governments in thinking around very concrete cases, and wrapping their head around how to develop an Article 6 policy that would make sense and be useful for their own objectives.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Frédéric. We have a couple of questions which have come up in the chat, but if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to add them. Before we go to the questions which are in the chat so far, I just wanted to give one follow-up on the back of what Frédéric was saying just now, and that's I mean, I worked in the government before moving over to Gold Standard in the UK government and worked on carbon markets there, and I would have been the right person to come to with carbon market questions, but not to say whether a particular project is the right thing to fit alongside the NDC and to support the long-term strategy. And I guess this is one of the big differences which you have now with Article 6 is it's not only the technical carbon market person in the government who needs to understand this, it's other people within the government. And I'd be really interested maybe hearing from Alexandra if there's any experience that you've got in terms of working with governments on building capacity where this has come through and you're having to engage across different parts of government, or anyone else who wants to answer on this, because I think it's an important difference between markets in the past and Article 6.
Yeah, maybe I can give some initial feedback on this. So the experience that we see, especially with the most active countries that are engaging now in Article 6, especially Ghana, that there is relatively little concern about these corresponding adjustments, and they are really focusing on their conditional NDC and want to move ahead as quickly as possible to access finance to implement the NDCs. Of course, being fully aware of the corresponding adjustment requirement and that this will impact their NDC, but nevertheless, they are keen to to really implement projects. This is their clear priority. So we don't see a lot of hesitation from these most active governments and not major concerns at the moment. Yeah.
Anyone else in this question? If not, I'll go to some of the questions we've received in the chat. So we had a question from Lev Gantley about COP27. So what are the key points that the panel would like to see the supervisory body, so that's the Article 6.4 supervisory body, providing guidance on this year? And I think it'd be helpful to hear about the Article 6.4 supervisory body, but then also there may be more guidance on Article 6.2 as well. So I don't know if anyone wants to say a little bit more about what they hope to see at the end of this year. Aglaja, I might pick on you if no one else.
Yes, happy to. Well, I think the supervisory body is supposed to meet at least twice this year. And so I do hope we see a first meeting soon, once I understand that the nomination process is still ongoing, but let's hope that they get to meet together soon, because they do have quite a charge workload. And I think especially for this year, now understanding that the whole process of putting the mechanism up to work will, I would say, at least take until 2024. Let's say what they could start sorting out this year is to think about the process for the transition of CDM activities together with parties, discussing, okay, what could be the conditions, what could be the checks that are necessary. I think that is very important. But then also there's limited information on the independent grievance process that is to be put up. And I think it's a huge improvement that this grievance process made it part of the rules. And I would hope that the body starts developing as part of its rules of procedures, how that process would look like, how it would be independent, how it could be ensured that the grievances are taken up in a good way and the process is accessible. So I think that is a key, clearly important. Another one really important one is the methodological requirements for removal activities, which will start to be discussed specifically for the 6.4 mechanism. I think that is absolutely crucial. Under CDM, there were a lot of discussions on removal activities. There were the first rules also on some negative emission technologies, but they were never applied. But then we had rules for the forestry and land use sectors, which proved to be quite cumbersome and not attractive at all. So I would say it's quite an interesting time to have a new go-ahead of how the international mechanism will go with these activities and put the necessary safeguards in place, find new approaches. So as well as the review of the CDM Sustainable Development Tool and other tools that are available. And I would hope that this leads to a very good 6.4 SD tool, or let's say the approval of a good SD tool. So those would be the areas that I would highlight for the supervisory body. But beyond that, I think there are quite some elements that will be important in negotiations. The discussion on whether emission avoidance and everything that's connected with the term, and in the context of increasing emissions in many developing countries around the world through economic development. I think that will be a very, very important discussion this year to have, and the definition of the scope of Article 6, as well as finalizing the reporting and review process, ensuring that the review process actually has teeth, and ensuring that the reporting is actually as granular as we need it. I think those would be my favorite, my hopes for this year, that we will get some good discussions and good rules on these elements.
Great. And Frédéric, I'll come to you in a second, but Aglaja, just quickly on you still, there was a follow-up question in the chat about the relationship between the tools which are being developed through Perspectives Initiative and the 6.4 supervisory body. So do you see any link between the two? Is there a hope that there is adoption?
Well, the tools that we are developing are currently independent, but we are having a very close look at the 6.4 requirements. So we're hoping to operationalize these requirements. And yes, one of the exit strategies of the strategy is that the tools could be submitted to the supervisory body. And they are supposed to be public good. They are supposed to be usable by anyone who wants to use them. They are, of course, also, they could be used in 6.2 collaboration. But yes, I think we will strive to engage with the Article 6.4 mechanism, and we hope to make a contribution to that debate, how the rules will look like.
Great, thank you very much. And Frédéric, over to you.
I was just going to add one point on what might be expected next at the next COP on 6.2, and we will be looking for further guidance on the two methods for conducting the corresponding adjustment. I think that's another key aspect to keep in mind for a working Article 6.
Yeah, great, thank you for that. Emma.
I think it's very relevant, both what Aglaja and Frédéric brought up here, but an additional point that is coming up in the negotiations that we have, the bilateral negotiations for these framework agreements, is the procedures and management of share proceeds for adaptation, both on the 6.2 and 6.4. This is something that we would like to see more clarity on, especially on the 6.2. I mean, how is this supposed to be managed? There are various ways to do this, basically, where we see now that some countries are, host countries are establishing their own funds, for example, where they would like to have share proceeds from the projects. And yeah, from our side, this would be great to clarify, so that we can move forward with our frameworks, basically.
Great, thank you. And there was a question in the chat for Alexandra and Emma about just trying to capture this. So about the fact that mitigation projects, so the projects which are kind of being developed and running on the ground, operate over the long term, but NDCs will be updated and new NDCs will be put into place kind of over time, maybe during the life cycle of the project. And the question is, how will bilateral agreements address this risk, so address the change in NDC status over time? I don't know, Emma or Alexandra, if you're able to take that. Yeah,
I mean, I can start perhaps. I mean, first of all, our bilateral agreements are different from the MOPAs that we sign. So bilateral framework agreements only comprise kind of the general terms for the collaboration with the host countries. They are not activity or project specific. And in addition to the bilateral framework agreement, we will have a MOPA, a commercial contract, a MOPA sign, which is activity specific. And I mean, the idea is that the crediting periods will be rather short for many of the projects. And that basically addresses this concern that is raised here, that the market changes, and it might be that some projects are only additional for the first 5 years, and they will be reassessed after a short crediting period in between the NDC period. So I think that's the way that we will address this from our side.
Yeah, maybe I can add also a few words here. So very similar to what Emma said, the largest projects that UNDP is currently involved in have a relatively short crediting period, and they will be reassessed after the short crediting period. Yeah, so they are not long term. Yeah.
Aglaja.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, of course, there might be activities that will need, let's say, to be sustained longer by any sort of funding to actually, give the investment certainty. And I think we have been discussing this a lot, and we will see, of course, shorter crediting periods that will then be renewed. And I think we need to make a differentiation between the assessments of regulatory additionality, because, of course, the host country can include measures in their NDC and incentivize them through their own measures. But especially when it comes to reassessing financial additionality, it really depends on whether it's an activity with a once-off investment at the beginning that then is kind of, you get return on investments over time, or whether you have programs with renewed investments where, let's say, the investment parameters change over time. So actually financial additionality may change over time. Let's say the renewed investments are being done under different conditions than the initial one. And I think we will still see activities that will need longer crediting periods, and the 6.4 mechanism recognized it in particular for forestry. And I think it will be a lot of, it will be very important to develop clear rules, which activities, for program developers, what is my appropriate crediting period? What will be reassessed at the end? What will not be reassessed? What is my clarity on, how long I will get returns on the international carbon market for it? And I think it's a very interesting parameter in the future for program developers.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for that. There's a couple more questions which I want to try to address before we run out of time at the hour. We've had a more kind of specific question from Dana Chowran about the cook stove sector and whether the panel considers it likely that the cook stove sector will move from being a popular voluntary market activity to being a common component of Article 6 programs. So I don't know if anyone wants to take this question. I think, the thing which I would say from our perspective, the cook stove portfolio is a incredibly important part of Gold Standard's portfolio. And I think this comes back to the point that we talked about earlier in my mind about NDC alignment. And it kind of really depends on a country by country basis how cook stoves are treated within the NDC and whether the host country sees this being an integral part of achieving their NDC, or whether it sees mitigation activities within the cook stove sector to be go beyond their NDC and to be something which can be transferred internationally. But from our perspective, either way, there's a need for finance and there's a need for projects. So that's the way that I would see this. And Aglaja.
I would just like to add that I think especially for the cook stove sector, when you think of it under Article 6, there are some methodological revisions needed to the usually applied methodologies, particularly when it gets to how the accounting for non-renewable biomass is done, because it's not fully aligned with national inventories, which then leads to issues when you're doing the corresponding adjustment. But there are also some issues when you're doing corresponding adjustment and your, let's say, your methodology assumes suppressed demand. So I think it's really important also discussion to have around, like, more broadly, what are activities where carbon credits will result in being used as offsets, and what are activities where carbon market mechanisms are used to mobilize climate finance. And just because an activity doesn't mean, well, I think there must be different standards, because a lot of activities need finance, are good things to do. They contribute to mitigation, they contribute to green growth, but or let's say green development pathways of countries, but not all of them should be used as offsets. And I think that's a discussion to have now. And I think whether that qualifies for the cook stove sectors is, as you said, a country by country discussion to be had.
Yeah, great, thank you. We're getting to the point now where we probably won't be able to answer all of the questions which are in the chat, but there's a question which has just come in which I'd like to ask. And the question is about the recent decision from Indonesia to stop issuances of credits. I don't think the question's right. I don't think they've kind of seized issuance of credits, but there is a kind of regulation in place which means that there's more of a government role in looking at the projects which take place within the jurisdiction. But I'd be interested in, I guess you can answer this question specifically, or maybe in a more general way, about kind of signs which we've seen from some governments that they're looking to have more control over an understanding of the projects which are taking place within the jurisdiction, and what that means for the way that the market has operated so far. So I don't know if anyone wants to take this question. Frédéric.
Yeah, I can jump in on this. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market at this point for project developers like South Pole. So in some countries, the voluntary market, as we know it, without the necessity of having corresponding adjustment, is continuing. That's what we mostly source, and that's what most corporates today buy. But the market is clearly changing because of regulations or expectations around what legitimate corporate claims are, because of the host countries, host countries' concerns around their NDCs and how they will go about figuring out what they do with voluntary projects and the export of emission reductions. And so the case of Indonesia is, a first one, I think, that we're seeing, or perhaps a second one where there was a full stop, but it's something that is on the mind of various countries, and hopefully other approaches are also possible to actually provide the guidance to the project developers as to how to what sectors to go to and what is required in different countries. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and it makes it really difficult to navigate. And there's a huge need to accelerate the work on capacity building and on different tools, so that governments can see clearly and provide the guidance, so that the capital can actually flow to these projects that are needed, like you mentioned on cook stoves, Hugh.
Yeah, great. And I'm going to ask one more question from the chat that we've got, and then I think we'll close after that. So there's a question which has come through about, talking about uncertainty and navigation. There's a question about the relationship between Article 6 and the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, so the core carbon principles that it's developing, and also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which is primarily focused on producing claims guidelines. And I might just answer this kind of quickly, and then if anyone else wants to provide a little bit more of an insight into this afterwards on the relationship between them, that would be great. But as we see this in Gold Standard, I mean, there are kind of two kind of primary drivers and kind of external forces in terms of how we need to think about how our standard evolves over the next few years. One of those is Paris alignment and aligning with what's come out of Article 6 and making sure that our standard is aligned with what's required in the Paris context. And then the other one is the principles which will be developed or are being developed by the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market. And the expectation is that these two will align, that the Integrity Council will adopt principles which kind of embed within them Paris alignment. But these are two important drivers of the work of standards at the moment. And then on my side, I think the VCMI could have a very important role in answering one of the big questions which Article 6 didn't really answer last November, which is whether and when corresponding adjustments are required for the voluntary carbon market. Article 6 provided a route for that, the Article 6 guidance, but it didn't say when and whether that's required. And that's an important question that the VCMI could provide clarity on, because I don't think we're going to get that out of further negotiations at the UN level. Is there anything else anyone would like to add on this question before we close off? If not, we're coming up to the end here. We have a minute left, and this has been really interesting and engaging. It's really encouraging, I think, the work which all of you are doing in this panel to develop the tools, to start to implement the projects, to support governments, or as a government to try to raise the bar in terms of what Article 6 activities and what cooperative approaches look like. Hopefully this has been helpful for those who've been listening in as well. And I know that many of those who are listening in are also actively working on Article 6 implementation. We haven't been able to answer all the questions, but I think we got through many of them. We will share a recording of this webinar afterwards, so you will be able to see that. And this is part of a series, as I mentioned earlier, of webinars that Gold Standard is running over the course of this year to dig into how Article 6 is being implemented and some of the big issues as that happens. So I'd really like to thank my panelists for joining us today, and thank everyone who listened in, for being here, for your questions. And with that, thank you and goodbye to everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.